Good evening. This is Goldie. It's June 23rd, 2010, and this is our third official week of Wednesday night broadcast. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to the prior ones in this show, and especially for your emails, texts, and calls. I pray that I've given you some hope. I'm trying to avoid all the naysaying and maybe come up with some frank discussions that cut to the heart of the issues and maybe come up with a solution or two. Please keep the emails and Facebook comments coming. I apologize if the call-in feature is not working yet. There's some kind of delay problem with the interweb. We're also doing a slightly new format where my guest will join us later. Let's go ahead and we're again going to start off and go through, get to the heart of some issues through the BP oil spill. I know I'm kicking a dead horse here, but it continues to spew. We continue to hear rhetoric regarding further regulations. I want you all to remember the two big questions from last week that you need to keep in mind at all times. The first one is, what is the commons? And the second one was, how do we most cheaply protect and repair the commons? To those two, I want to add a third, almost rhetorical question from my friend Paul. Do you believe that capitalism as it currently has evolved in the United States ultimately may lead to the destruction of our democracy? I just want to go over for a couple of minutes. Again, the commons is air, land, and water, not owned by anybody, but controlled by our government for the benefit of the community. For the purposes of BP, the commons includes the U.S. government granting leases or entering into leases with BP for them to drill offshore, and as well as the surrounding ocean, gulf, marshlands, beaches. We won't say livelihoods of the workers. Let's start out by going into the current messages that we're seeing. Again, on Fox, God bless those guys. I love them. Love them. Those guys are still as confused as the Republican Party message if you've been watching TV at all this past week. One thing that Fox and the Republican Party do agree on, and they have a pretty good agreement on, is that by connecting the initial accident with Obama's failure to cap the well, as well as his failure to immediately clean up the spill, all of this is Obama's incompetent fault. They are extremely consistent on this message. So when you hear the message, why did it take so long? It's day 65, it's day 68. Know that that is the message. Second part of the message that came out this week, which they're starting to work on because Obama has brought up the point that potentially now is the time for comprehensive energy reform. Mitch McConnell stated on Sunday that cap and trade is a national energy tax. So, and I heard national energy tax several times on Sunday. When you hear the phrase national energy tax, it is a Republican message opposing cap and trade. And in fact, they'll say it this way, which I've done before with public safety cameras going, excuse me, surveillance cameras. These guys go, Obama is supporting cap and trade, Obama is proposing a national energy tax. Excuse me, cap and trade. So they even do it with that methodology. That's a current message. They also brought up, Mitch McConnell brought it up, that BP supports cap and trade. So he is saying that Obama's cap and trade policy is also supported by the evildoers at BP, and we'll talk about evil later. Neil Cavuto said this past week that Obama is using an emergency to expand his executive power. Hint, the moratorium and increased regulations. Again, that's his message, okay? We'll get into some details and some of the nitty-gritty. You know, if I were hearing that message, I would ask, what about George Bush using a national emergency to expand his power and hand out no-bid contracts, etc. I'm only arguing the message there. Another message, Ben Stein on Saturday said that this $20 billion fund was an unconstitutional shakedown, like the GM, Chrysler, and bondholder cramdowns. Rush Limbaugh and Joe Barton called the $20 billion fund a shakedown. And Rush added that it's a union slush fund. That's his message. A union slush fund. I would immediately counter this particular message by saying that this was an administrative action, which is within the existing constitutional authority for the executive branch. When I saw the furor over the $20 billion fund that was voluntarily agreed to by BP, I saw that they missed a chance to talk about the real issue there. So last week, when I was all excited on Wednesday that Obama was giving a speech on Tuesday, and I heard the speech and listened to it, and there was almost nothing in there. There was some messages that just didn't really do anything. He did say at least one important thing in the speech, and he said it twice. And I might have brought this up last week, but I'm going to bring it up again. He brought up the word reckless, which in the legal world gets us into a concept called gross negligence, which is beyond negligence. It's a reckless disregard. Now, the importance of hearing that word reckless or gross negligence, or even intentional misconduct, is that it makes it easy for the federal government to trigger the civil penalties that are in the 1990 statute of $1,000 a gallon, and or the withdrawal or non-granting of future permits for drilling. So instead of it being a shakedown, it was actually, at least this is Goldy's opinion, I saw an intense negotiation by one party who has some rights under contracts, permits, regulations, and laws, and these parties are represented. It's not like it's just Joe Guy buying a house and he doesn't have an attorney. And BP is obviously represented by its counsel. And they were in there, and they know they've got a real big problem. Their stock prices dropped dramatically. It's hard to beat the emotions once your stock starts getting hammered. So as far as it being a shakedown, I guess if one party to a transaction uses the advantages that it may have under the existing contracts, and I'm going to use the laws of the land as well as the permit regulations that are there as the word contract, if one party uses the advantages that it may have negotiated in those contracts to get a better deal than is called for under the contract, and forego potentially, we haven't actually seen a copy of the agreement, forego potentially some of these penalties that would clearly bankrupt them. At $1,000 a gallon, we're done. There's 55 gallons in a barrel. That's 55,000. It would not. They would not be able to make it. It's not a shakedown. It's a negotiation, and it was a pretty good negotiation because those people that are harmed, that there are some direct damages to, as well as the cleanup costs, if BP just fought those costs and the federal government had cleaned them up and had just gone ahead and paid the fishermen, it could have taken years for these people to be paid any money. Now, the bad part, and we have talked about the commons and one of the defects in the left, in that they never start their sentences with, we understand that corporations need to maximize their profits, comma, however, we want to protect this wildlife. The bad part of this is the threat that the Obama administration used of raising that $75 million cap retroactively. Ex post facto law would be what it would be called, unless BP would fund the $20 billion above and beyond what they were required to do. The bad part of this is that we have commons, we have oil wells that we want drilled. We need consistency in our regulations. We need consistency for our corporations to be able to maximize their profits. What I brought up last week was it's our duty to make sure that those regulations do what we want them to do as far as protecting the commons. It's not our duty, and it's not BP's duty, to worry about items that may go beyond what that statute says or those regulations say. Now, we know that uncertainty hurts the free market, hurts the corporations. They can't plan. BP honestly said today that they were going to postpone any new drilling that they're going to do there, whether or not that judge had defeated the moratorium put in place by the Obama administration. Now, this uncertainty with regulation is the thing that Rush and Joe Barton should have actually been arguing about, instead of just placating their constituent, which is these oil companies that give them money, advertise on their programs, etc. So when we see what a real message should be, and the real message should be that Obama negotiated on our behalf beyond what we were entitled to as citizens, and he did that instead of it being a shakedown, it was an actual good negotiation, the kind of thing that we want to have happen. They talked about it as being a slush fund and whatever else. You can tell by their message that they don't care truly about the issue. They're just shilling for their party. So here's the time that it's important to look at the message without getting upset over the message and determine what are they doing on the message and how far away are they from the actual structural defect that we maybe need to fix. And it turns out that those guys, which have a lot of listeners, I mean, Barton was on the national stage there at a hearing on Capitol Hill. Rush has 20 million listeners. So do you think you're going to hear any of these things that I bring up about the commons, the necessity of taking care of regulations so that they actually do have teeth against corporations? You're not going to hear that. You're going to hear that message that this is a fake, this is a slush fund for unions. When you hear that message, you know that the person is listening to Fox, and you know that they're not interested, they may or may not be interested in actually getting to the structural problems. Now, another part of the message that we heard this week, which was a lot of commentators were arguing, and you heard this out of some of the Gulf states as well, that BP and the other oil companies, because of the moratorium, they're going to drill elsewhere and take the jobs overseas. The oil under the ground here is a treasure. It's not going to go away. It's not going anywhere. I mean, it's spewing out right now because we haven't capped it. But it's not like technology jobs that might permanently, that might permanently go overseas. So when you hear that message, there's 150,000 jobs that are dependent on deep water drilling on the 32 rigs, I guess. You know that, again, you're hearing a message. It's purely an anti-regulation message. And it's attached to, and Obama is incompetent and we need to throw him out in 12 and we need to throw the Democrats out in 10. Just think about that for a second. Them saying, we're not going to drill it. Whatever oil is at right now, $82 a gallon, $82 a barrel, excuse me. Think. If we impose a requirement that costs more money, they're not going to be able to recoup it on the open market because they sell their oil at whatever that market is. So I can agree with that. But does that just then mean that when the price of oil gets to $90 a barrel, they'll come back? I'm going to go ahead and assert that that is the case. In fact, as soon as oil gets to 100, 120, 150, I'm not even worried about them being forced to drill another relief well with all of these offshore wells, since it's obvious that there is not the technology available to prevent this kind of spill. The current message that we hear from the Gulf states is that the feds are not doing enough. Remember Bobby Jindal? He's all over. And that the feds aren't doing anything about this spill. In fact, they're hindering the cleanup efforts. But then they say, in the same breath, it's actually not in the same breath, it's later. They say that the moratorium on deep water drilling is more harmful, and they will lose the jobs. So the question is, right now, the fishermen have lost their jobs. The deep water drillers, they want to put them back to work. So you're hearing a message from the Gulf states that we need to keep these jobs. Again, you're hearing the message. You're not hearing the substance. Because who knows what the message is? Obama's incompetent. We need to keep these jobs. Don't impose more regulations. I need to get reelected. That's the message. And this is the only thing I have to say to Louisiana. Don't you think that a moratorium would help prevent the next spill? I mean, if it turns out that one blowout preventer is not enough, but 4 need to be there to be able to shear the pipe in the event that there's a problem. I was on Keith Olbermann the other night. I never watched Keith, but he at least was explaining what a blowout preventer is. Don't you think that you would want this type of spill to never happen again if you lived in one of those Gulf states? Apparently not. There's 150,000 voters. Those guys are making money, they're voting. Some of these fishermen may not vote, who knows? But it's kind of a mixed message that you're getting from the Gulf states. It's not a mixed message. It's Obama's wrong, whatever he's doing. Obama caused it. And don't impose more regulations, we don't want to lose those jobs. And a moratorium is stupid. They talked about last week that BP actually, if we get to some of the details, they used the string method of blowout prevention, and they didn't do a redundancy of fail-safe systems. And apparently redundancy is the way that you can prevent catastrophic items from happening. They saved $7 to $10 million, but it was approved by the feds. It was legal under the permit. Think about that. It was legal under the permit for them to do that. I had some good arguments this week with some friends about this idea of whether or not they did evil by not spending the extra $7 to $10 million. They also didn't drill a second relief well. Who knows how much that would cost? It's required by other countries. It's not required under U.S. regulations. It costs too much money, is I'm sure what they argue. We won't be able to drill this well. Well, that makes an easy argument for actually requiring it. Because when the price of oil gets high enough, which it will, they'll drill a second well next to any of these deep water wells so that we don't have this problem again. Very good friend of mine, Coop. We talked yesterday, and he brought up a point that I've seen throughout the media, that BP is evil, and what they did was evil, and that there is evil in the world. Now, I didn't want to get into a big philosophical, discussion about good and evil, but I would argue that the use of the word evil for this problem clouds over the attempts to get to the structural problems in the regulations. Because whenever you attach a word like evil, which it might mean against God, it might mean illegal, a violation of a criminal law, or it can mean whatever the speaker wants it to mean. It's a pure message word. The word evil is a message word. It is completely without content. You think you know what evil means. I think I know what evil means. Just listen to this use of the word evil. Dick Cheney's use of faulty intelligence to get us into the Iraq War makes him evil. How many times did you hear that? And nod your head. How many times did I nod my head? I'll admit to it. Now, under contract law, which we talked about last week, at least when I took contracts, the breach of a contract was not an immoral, and I use the word immoral attached to the word evil. It's not immoral to breach your contract. You're going to have damages under that contract. And when I say contract, I'm talking about permits, laws, regulations, etc. Now, my buddy was arguing that I'm only doing this in some type of economics and the law analysis. I admitted that that's true. When you see the spill, though, it's ugly. Now they took the cap off it today. It's just shooting out oil. It's bad. But it's not evil. Now, if it's not illegal under criminal law, this is just how I'm going to define it, it's not evil under civil law. Civil law is what we're talking about, the system of contracts that we have, the leases, the regulations, the laws, permits, and contracts. We just have damages. It's not evil. Now, the bad fact is people died. That's bad. That's always bad. But I hate to say it, corporations do make calculations of a person's life and what it's worth. They do it all day long. They calculate how much it's going to cost. All right, what happens if we have a total loss? Well, 30 people are going to die. It's going to cost us at least $10 million, unless there's a cap in that state that they get sued in. Now, he brought, this idea that there is evil in this, it just hurts to hear that word. That doesn't allow us to have discourse. I think the way that it works is you've got a board of directors up there of any corporation. They hear the cost of the item that you're going to do, whether it's well drilling or doing whatever, or building a nuclear power plant. Cost of the alternatives that you can do, scrubbers at a coal plant, no scrubbers. Are you going to get sued later for lead poisoning? How much is our insurance going to cost us? We're going to have 35 workers out there. What does our insurance cost us if we don't have this fourth blowout preventer? It costs us this much more. And then they make the decision. They take the risk. They do this all the time. Now again, I assume for our discussion, for our theoretical discussion of the BP problem, that what they did was not illegal. So until we actually find out whether or not they're actual criminal charges, in other words, somebody said, I want people to die, or I recklessly did something that caused people to die, which may be illegal under the statute. We don't know. We'll find out. So I'm trying to be theoretical here so that we can potentially come up with solutions to prevent the next spill and come up with a system of regulations that will work. Now, I don't want anybody to really use their outrage. And when you hear the word evil, you know that's what you're doing. You know that's what you're getting ready to hear. People are using their outrage to say, BP's evil, the Obama administration's evil, we need to get rid of them. That's not sensible discourse. But when you hear that message, when you hear that word, and Coop, I invite you to actually bring up examples. If you could give me an example of where they were actually evil, even though it increased the risk of a death to a person. That happens all the time. I mean, that happens in every decision that you make every day. I mean, if the statute says that your railing needs to be 36 inches high, is it more or less evil that you built your railing to 42 inches high? Am I less evil because I exceeded the statute? See, it just doesn't make any sense to me. My buddy Scott sent me an email, and he was talking about that he has chosen, I mean, this is a little discussion of the evil, that he chose the wind option on his electrical provider. So there's like an all-wind option, costs more money. I mean, I guess what he's doing there is doing maybe altruistic behavior. He's got children. So maybe he is actually not doing something that's altruistic at all. It's not a giving behavior. It's a selfish behavior, is what I'm going to argue. It's a selfish behavior. Selfish is good. It's like in the movie Wall Street. Greed is good because it makes you maximize your benefits. So to the extent that he can get more people to pick the wind power and help more demand come from the wind power, he's helping his children in their future. It's actually a selfish act. And again, I'm not trying to, I'm using the word selfish not in the bad way that we use it. You know, somebody's selfish because they're not sharing with their friends. Another example is that daily I walk up the hill. It's like a 1.5 mile walk. I carry 2 bags with me. One's for trash and one is for recycling. So I walk up one side of the road and back down the other. And it's one of the cleanest streets in western Travis County. Am I actually doing an altruistic behavior? I mean, am I doing this for my fellow citizens? Am I doing it for the environment? One of the reasons I'm doing it is my house is for rent, and I want to rent it. And I don't want cans or papers or other things to obscure the for rent sign when people walk past or drive past my house. That's a selfish act. When I drive down that street, I don't want to see cans or trash. I'm going to argue that that is a selfish behavior. When I was down in Samra, Costa Rica, a friend of mine, Bubba, organized some beach cleanups. It takes about 6 people, 3 or 4 hours to clean up a 1/4 mile of beach that's in front of the town. I'm going to again argue that it's a selfish act on all our parts. Now we have to give our time. I feel like I have contributed in my carbon footprint plenty, and then I have to give my time back. So it's a payback. Not really an altruistic act. For those people that have businesses that are dependent on these being clean beaches, it's not an altruistic act. Whether or not you have the time to do it or get paid to do it doesn't matter. I'm saying that most altruistic acts, and this will become a very important point in immigration reform and the commons and how many people we let into this country. Because Garrett Hardin actually argues that there are no true altruistic acts, because if you say, well, I want to let some people in the country, why don't we just let everybody in the country? If we send food over to a starving population, why don't we send all of our food to all the starving populations? Why don't we be altruistic? Well, because we'll have no food left for us. So using the word altruistic, it's a tough word. Using the word good. Is my friend Scott good because he's chosen the wind? Am I good because I pick up the trash? Is BP good, or is Shell or Exxon good because they went above and beyond what the statute requires, what the regulations require? Are they good? Are they doing altruistic behavior? Now, when you look at it in terms of those oil companies, you know that they're not trying to be good. They've done a risk assessment, and that risk assessment says we're better off building a second well right next door because we don't want to afford, we don't want to pay whatever this is going to end up costing, $100 billion if they can afford it. So when you back into it by looking at other behaviors that we do from day to day, which are generally selfish behaviors, the selfish behaviors make sense. Truly altruistic behaviors, I mean, just giving away your money, you're Bill Gates, you have billions. Okay, that might be altruistic behavior. He's just giving away the remaining billions that he has. It's not going to affect him. So it's not even a moral choice for him. He's just got too much money. He's not going to be able to get rid of it all. Now, we talked last week a little bit about items that fall within the definition of the commons, air, land, and water. And I kind of want to see if we can start adding or discussing the addition of an item to the commons. Now, I've argued in the past that the health of the nation is a commons. And so when we start getting into the healthcare discussion, which I'm not going to do today, I'm doing this as a preamble so that y'all can start thinking about it. Start thinking about the health of the nation and the healthcare plan. And is it a commons? And what's the cheapest way to protect that commons? I want to actually look at it in terms of a much smaller type of insurance, which is the home insurance and home insurance regulation in Texas. It turns out that in order to get a loan on your home, you have to get casualty insurance that's payable to the benefit of your lender. It's actually in the regulations. So if you're going to get a loan that's sold in the secondary market, you're going to have insurance on that property that equals the amount of the loan. Now that doesn't quite make sense because you only insure the structure usually. The land is still there. So when a structure burns down, you get paid $250,000, the $100,000 land is still there. But the loan might have been for the $250,000. So there's a slight disconnect between that requirement of having home insurance and the actual value of the home. But in any event, turns out you've got to have home insurance. Now, if you've paid off your home, you don't have to carry insurance. What is the percentage of people that have paid off their homes? Near zero. 1%, 2%. It's a de minimis number. It doesn't matter for our argument. If you're going to buy a home and own a home today in the United States, you're going to have insurance on it. So to me, that requirement of insurance, because everybody has to have it, it becomes something that maybe it's not a commons, but it is something that allows us to say, I'm okay with regulating it. And let's just look at what goes on in Texas. And this was in a Texas Observer article from June 11th, talking about State Farm and the 2003 changes that happened. Governor Perry appoints the commissioners to the Texas Department of Insurance. The Texas Department of Insurance restricts the number of companies that come into Texas and do business here, okay? And the number that sell insurance. And we have a system here that's called, well, I don't know, I can't exactly, I don't remember what that phrase is. It's just like, you raise your rates and then you file the raise. After you've raised the rates, there's an extremely complicated system of determining whether the rates are excessive. And if they are excessive, then the insurance companies would be required, or that particular insurance company would be required to roll back its rates and potentially refund. For 5 years, State Farm has been fighting in the courts a 12% reduction that was ordered by the Texas Department of Insurance. Now here in Texas, we have the second highest rates in the country after Florida. We used to have the first. We've got a system here, and if you think about it, which we know that most Republican voters, and really most Texas voters that have reelected Perry, have not thought about. And that is, they all whine about the cost of their homeowners insurance. This one's a simple matter. The person that's sitting in the governor's mansion appoints the commissioners of the Texas Department of Insurance. Now, the legislature determines what the law is as to whether or not they can force rollbacks. But if you're a Republican voter and you voted all these nuts in, and I say nuts because the Texas legislature is a little nuttier. Really is. There's a lot of old stories about these guys. Killer bees, people fleeing the state so you didn't have a quorum. People that voted for these guys are either, they knew that a pro-business sentiment and pro-business laws would come into effect. They either knew it or they didn't know it, and are just uneducated. Now, I assert it's the latter. I believe most people are generally uneducated. It's tough. It's tough to put food on the table, go to work, take care of your kids. But don't whine about insurance rates and then send Republicans back to the State House. So when you hear that message here in Texas, we need to roll back these insurance rates, it's ridiculous. Just ask them, did they vote for Perry and did they vote the Republican ticket? Then just tell them to shut up. Because you're not going to get a reasoned discourse out of that message. That's not what happens. So I'm using the example, the kind of easy example of home insurance in Texas as a way to kind of start talking about healthcare as potentially a commons and something that should be regulated. I mean, insurance originally was, you lived in a village, your house burned down, everybody chipped in and helped you rebuild. The community got together and did it. Then the community got together and said, we need a fire department, so that when a house is on fire, maybe we can put it out. And it'll be cheaper to have a fire department than to rebuild everybody's house when it burns down. Then at some point, they decided you needed to have GFI breakers so that fires didn't start, or sprinklers in commercial buildings. And we created a system of regulations to help prevent the fires and lower the cost of a burn down, complete and total loss. Then we actually got together and said, you know what, I don't want to help my buddy rebuild his house, and I don't want to chip in for the materials, and I don't want to do the labor, but I'll tell you what, let's all start a little fund that we all put in money, and if one of us burns down, they can go into that fund and avoid the catastrophic loss of not having the money to rebuild. And that way I don't have to be a fireman, and I don't have to help you rebuild. Then we got to a system of for-profit companies administering that insurance. And when a for-profit insurance company administers the insurance, this fund that we as a community put together, they're going to make more money by not paying the claims. Hence, we see the structural problem. It's the same problem in healthcare. for-profit insurance being used, and they make more profits when they don't pay the claims that we originally put the system together to pay. Sorry, bad English. We put the system together in order to pay these claims. But now these guys want to make these profits. If they can find a way to not pay claims, they're going to make more profits. The structural problem. Hang on, I'm going to grab my guest here real quick. So we're going to talk about, in the weeks to come, we're going to talk about healthcare. Trying to get Wilcox on the line. Now I'm going to go over a couple of things from last week's rant. All right, Wilcox, we got you on here. I don't know if you were listening to that portion, but what I did was I want to back into healthcare at some time in the future. So as an introduction to healthcare, I was explaining our current system of homeowners insurance in Texas and kind of that structural flaw. So in any event, I've gone past that, and what I want to do is I'm going to do a clarification of last week's rant that we talked about. That was the 61610. There's a missing portion between part 1 and part 2. Uh-oh. Yeah, you remember that. That was when it was my appreciation of South Park's investigation of politically correct speech.
That's correct.
Yeah, they used, they came up with a method of putting an inappropriate word, the N-word, inside of 2 sets of quotation marks. In other words, it's a joke because it's a cartoon, and then it's another joke inside that cartoon. And they're really attempting to get me to say the word. Now, for me, that word is never appropriate. And again, all I'm doing is connecting the 2 rants. It's not on the recording, so this will help some of the viewers that are going back to see it. Now, I'm never going to say that word. I always think it's inappropriate because I think it reasonably offends a lot of people. That's my opinion. And then what I was doing was I was trying to connect that and that idea of politically correct speech or inappropriate speech or offensive speech to the outrageous image used by Lyndon LaRouche of putting a Hitler mustache on Obama and then putting those posters up outside of the post office. I argued, and you may remember, that the inappropriate speech can obscure your message.
It can.
And it did.
They don't care, though.
Obviously they don't, but I mean sometimes these outrageous things need to be done. I mean if Rush is saying that it's a slush fund, okay, his message is the 20 billion is a slush fund. His method is by radio, and what he's trying to do is say Obama is bad. In that case, he's got 20 million people nodding their head. Now, how many Rush listeners have you talked to that have argued the point that it's not a slush fund?
Well, I don't know how many, Limbaugh claims not to be taking his orders from the GOP or being paid by them. Although he signs off on almost everything that they do. Even George Bush Jr., who, with whom he had major issues, but whenever he had issues with him, they were always muted. Oh yeah, the illegal immigration problem. Oh yeah, it's a huge problem. He's got to do something about it, but it always got muted. He really didn't take out the hammer. When it came to something he really disagreed with Bush about.
Of course, and that's the same thing that Cavuto did this past weekend, and has done in the past when he's talking about Obama using this catastrophe as an expansion of executive power. Where were you guys during the Bush administration? The greatest expansion of executive power of all time. Well, I mean, not of all time. I mean, the court-packing FDR type of stuff.
Yeah, FDR stuff. That was the biggest.
Yeah, take it easy. But my point is there that when you're hearing that message, it's pretty easy to know, and I had talked about earlier that both Rush and Joe Barton, they weren't trying to get to the structural deficiencies of regulation. They were trying to say Obama's bad. And you can tell that by what their message is, because it makes no sense at all. Slush fund? What?
Well, yeah, what's slush fund?
In any event,
I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about slush funds, that the whole stimulus package, was just a way to pass out goodies to your buddies.
No, I understand.
All that. That was the original concept of the slush fund in the modern era.
I understand. What I'm trying to point out, and all I'm doing is connecting the dots in our last week's speech, so this is like just going back to last week, that there are times when you hear a message, and it's so outrageous, it's so politically incorrect, that it clouds your actual thing that you're trying to do. And my argument was Lyndon LaRouche. And what I'm saying is that the message, while extremely outrageous for Rush and for Joe Barton, does not obscure what they're trying to do. That was kind of the point of the political correctness thing that we talk about. And so
they do better. Look, they're doing Rush Limbaugh is one of the best radio people there's ever been. He's
20 million,
the best.
20 million, absolutely.
And I mean, he's won all kinds of awards and everything else, and he's funny, which a lot of people don't appreciate. He is pretty tongue-in-cheek, cracks a lot of jokes, and a lot of liberals don't get it or want to get it or anything else. I mean, I can appreciate Keith Olbermann. He can be funny.
Right.
But, it's like, give the guy his due. If he cracks a good joke and he's funny, who cares?
Okay, all I was doing right there was a clarification. I'm going to do another clarification.
Okay.
And I got some good emails back this past week of some people that had gone back to my some of the prior rants. And I kind of want the viewers to understand that in these rants, we're trying to go down theoretical paths that may have no value. These paths, I call it a rant because it's like Sunday morning, drink coffee, sit there and just let your mind wander outside of the box. And if you do that, you can push the envelope. In a prior rant, I used the concept of irreparable harm, which I'm kind of proud of. Irreparable harm, to compare the penalty of capital punishment, death, with the irreparable harm done to a girl having her nude images put on YouTube forever by unauthorized leaks following installation of cameras by the Austin Police Department. So there's a potential for harm there, and what my point on that one was that it's interesting how you can use the concept of irreparable harm on some nice, clear-cut examples to compare two types of harm and argue that since the harm is irreparable, at least the way I define it, you can't do either of the two things. So for when you hear somebody say, well, there's no innocent people have ever been executed, or, well, we, the Austin Police Department, will never release those images, you're hearing a message, okay? But my response to that is that these two types of things can cause irreparable harm. And therefore, neither one should happen until we can, we need to determine how bad the irreparable harm is, because we may not want to have either one of those two things happening if the irreparable harm is too much. So when my friend EB, she sent one back to me in email, and she said, hey, you shouldn't just say that irreparable harm is putting somebody to death, but that putting an innocent man in jail for 20 years before letting him out is also irreparable harm. I say to EB, I agree with you. I understand. But I'm trying to also help come up with arguments that may sway. And to me, if you argue that somebody got into jail and was raped and, oh my God, was knifed and shanked and all this kind of stuff, I understand that, but it seems to me that it clouds that argument. What do you think about that? I mean, as far as just the argument.
First of all, I'm in favor of the death penalty, but the concept of irreparable harm, I mean, what are you trying to get to? Tell your people what you're trying to get to. You're trying to say that Are you taking an absolutist position that, you know, in the case of the death penalty, if one, hey, it's like the oil well deal, if one innocent man is put to death, do you throw the whole thing out?
Well,
If one oil well blows, do you shut down all drilling?
forever.
Forever.
Forever is really that question. Now, I'm not using irreparable harm in regard to the oil spill. I actually put a higher value
on the issue of life.
on life.
Taking action.
That's right. And I put a higher value on somebody's future forever through a breach of a civil liberty, a right to privacy. And so I actually put a higher level on it. You and I could discuss whether or not irreparable harm is putting one innocent man to death. I believe it is. You don't believe it is. That's fine. I mean, we don't need to.
No, I think there's a way to put guys to death with that. You can get DNA certainty. You also have people who admit it. If you've got DNA and a guy admits it and says, "Look, I want to go."
Yeah, but I actually don't want to. Yeah, I hear you. But coerced confessions, torture. You know that we can do a death penalty. Talk about that. I just wanted to bring up to EB the point that we have to speak in very simple phrases to convince. And they have to be very simple phrases that convince. And to the extent that there's complete judicial discretion and prosecutorial discretion over who gets tried for the death penalty, we already know how that goes, okay?
Well, it's alleged. I mean, you've got this overwhelming, supposedly racial component to things, and you wonder, you know, if there's an imbalance in the, you know, literally law enforcement going after black men, and you know that scientifically or statistically, I'm not sure. You know, I'm not sure we have overwhelming evidence of prejudice. It looks like it due to the numbers, but is it really prejudice that drives it?
Well,
You know, or what is it?
that's
I mean,
kind of
yeah.
when I post the immigration rant that we did, and we talk about do we ever want somebody singled out because of their color, I opine that I never want that to happen. Okay, it appears that it happens. Now, there are some studies that were done prior to the racial profiling laws that were passed in Texas in the mid-2000s, and all they were trying to do was get the DPS, Department of Public Safety, to actually put down the race of the person that they stopped, because on the tickets, you didn't even know who they pulled over. So you couldn't even determine whether it was disproportionately done or not, disproportionately of color or pulled over or not. Now, we know there was a Georgia study done in the early 70s with a Georgia case regarding number of, you know, your odds of getting a death penalty if you're black that kills a white versus a white that kills a black. But in any event, we will do another death penalty discussion again when we'll have an abortion and death penalty discussion. Now, I want to talk, and I'm going to clarify on my surveillance rant, which Wilcox has heard. It's kind of interesting. Currently, there are plans to put cameras up in downtown Austin. They pushed them away from 12th and Chicon. I have this rant up there now, and I did that speech in front of the Public Safety Commission last month. One of the arguments in my speech was that the Justice Department grant for the cameras was for violent and property crimes. And it turned out that the cameras were going to be put up in an area of prostitution and drug sales, which is not violent and property crimes.
That's right, there you go.
Okay, well, lo and behold, in a full-page ad, June 21st, report to the City Council. I don't know if you can see this. Austin American-Statesman. Full-page ad, which is, I guess this is taxpayer dollars, and it probably helps us understand what the budget is going to be like. They've now started saying, and I'll just read this portion to you, at the April meeting of this Public Safety Commission, The commission heard testimony from representatives of the FBI, DEA, DPS, and APD regarding the increasing gang drug cartel challenge in Austin, with an associated increase in violent and property crimes.
Yeah.
Okay? And that Austin has been designated a high-intensity drug area by the Office of the National Drug Control Policy. I'm kind of proud of this, all right? Because a part of what I'm doing is trying to come up with ways that you can argue and you can lobby. Okay?
And you attended.
Oh, yeah, I attended and I stated that. Now, the interesting thing is that it was me, several members of the ACLU, other civil liberty speakers that kept harping on that issue. That the Austin Police Department was going to be using grant money for things that they were not supposed to use it for. Now, my point on this is, I'm a little bit proud to have done that, but when you are lobbying or when you are arguing, you have to be very careful when you disclose your full argument to the opposition. Because now they're attempting to defeat our argument that those cameras are only supposed to be used for violent property crimes. And they've connected some testimony of drug sales that are potentially happening by cartels with violent and property crimes. And this is an open letter to the city council. Now, luckily, I caught it. The Austin City Council will hear about it, okay? Now, again, my point is, when you're arguing and you've got a point, you've got to be careful when you make your argument. And I'm saying this to everybody that's listening that ever wants to make an argument, and especially among elected officials. If you think you've got a good whopper of an argument, be careful when you make it. Save it. Save it sometimes. I had to use it. We had the manual. It said violent and property crimes. Here's a copy. They're not using it for that. You can't put these cameras up. Now they've started trying to make a connection. That's all I'm pointing out. Now, on a separate item on the surveillance, a June 22nd, 2010 Statesman article exclaims, states to investigate collecting of data by Google Map cars. And Google's disclosure that it had mistakenly gathered data has also captured the attention of lawmakers on Capitol Hill. In my surveillance rant, I talked not so much about Big Brother, but Big Stupid Brother. Now, I assume that the guys that were driving these cars around for Google, they weren't making much money, similar to the guys that are going to be watching these surveillance cameras. This confirms my assertion there's a similar danger from the images from these surveillance cameras. And the idea that the APD is just saying, this isn't going to happen, well, they're going to be transmitting these images by Wi-Fi. That's what Google did. They grabbed conversations on Wi-Fi. They're private industry. They're not even APD running around in these cars.
That's like arguing this. It's in the public domain. It's all information. We can grab it and we can rebroadcast it.
But my point is that when somebody is arguing that we can keep the images from these surveillance cameras safe, that's just, it's false. We know you can't. There was 100,000 emails disclosed by Apple on the new iPhone, or excuse me, on the iPad. Google is out there picking up images, and if the APD had been transmitting at that point, now it said it was only unsecured Wi-Fi. I don't know the answer. Was it secured Wi-Fi as well? But how the heck are we going to keep real quality hackers from getting this surveillance information? These Google guys were just cruising along in a car getting $10 an hour.
But you're right. I mean, the threat exists. Your privacy is going to be lost. Question is, what's your expectation of privacy?
My expectation of privacy is that camera's not shining inside my window. I will reiterate it.
Yeah.
Okay? They can't keep those images out of the public domain and the interwebs, the internets, YouTube. They can't do it. And again, I mean, all I'm doing is kind of clarifying a little bit that Google is now being hauled up there because they were hacking into regular private Wi-Fi. How do we possibly trust the awesome police department, the Fusion Center, the FBI, and the DEA keep those images private? We cannot. City council members, we cannot. You cannot guarantee it. What is the irreparable harm when those images get out there? Think.
Well, that's right.
Think.
How damaged is that young woman?
I can't even imagine that young woman that's never going to run for office or get into law school or get a job.
Oh, she'll get out. Come on, she's a victim. We'll represent her.
I understand. Okay. Here's one more point that I wanted to bring up. We're going over a little bit. One more point. 2 weeks ago, and it's about messaging, because Governor Jan Brewer is all about messaging. God bless her. She's trying over there in the Arizona law. And I'm going to go ahead and post the immigration rant so you know where we got to a couple of weeks ago. But I'm going to kind of introduce the immigration rant, which I'll post before the next show. This is a statement that Governor Jan Brewer said that she wants, of course she wants all illegals out of the country and out of her state, which was followed by, in quotes, "and take your children with you." Now, you know what this sounds like to me? Okay, and I'm only talking about her message, all right? I'm not talking about the content and what she's maybe really trying to do and getting Obama and the federal government to do their duty. This is what it sounds like to me. It says, take your little brown U.S. citizens back to Mexico with you. I thought she swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. Now, all I'm talking about is her message, and this is something I'm going to point out to the governor. If this is not your message, okay, the way I've interpreted it, take your U.S. citizens that were born in this country with you, then don't send out such a stupid message.
Oh, she's got a hell of a lot of support.
She's got a ton of support from white America and white Arizona.
Yeah, but you know what? You know what they're going to do? They should poll Hispanic Americans.
Well, we've talked about that before, but let me give you an example from O'Reilly a few days ago. He had on a gentleman who was from Los Angeles. He was a high school teacher, and he had brought some students to Arizona to protest against the law. So O'Reilly was like, "Aren't you brainwashing these kids? And didn't you know that 70% of America supports this law? And didn't you know that there's," and the teacher was arguing that this is racial profiling. And O'Reilly came back with, well, they've got racial profiling protections in there. The high school teacher, instead of using the arguments that we've talked about in the past as to bad survey questions, just said, I don't believe the 70% number, because I've seen all these people out here protesting. Instead of saying, first of all, have you read the statute, number one? Number two, do you have any fear of racial profiling against you? And if those two questions you answer yes, then the third question should be, do you support this law? And he didn't bring that up as his argument. And my suggestion is that anybody that's trying to fight the Arizona law needs to be able to bring up those questions that the survey question is wrong. Just think about it, the survey question. I mean, you see these things all day long on Fox. You see them on CNN. They're actually Reuters, I mean, there are Gallup poll questions. Do you approve of Obama? 55% of America wants to, in this last poll, wants to overturn the health care law. How many of them read it? How many of them have had a pre-existing condition? How many of them couldn't get insurance? How many of them's COBRA has worn out? My point was, the message that Jan Brewer threw out there sounds, I mean, it works for white America and white Arizona. It definitely doesn't work for minority Arizona or minority America or anybody who has that risk of racial profiling. And to be honest with you, it's a pretty offensive statement. Take your children with you. What about these citizens?
Well, we know where it comes from. probably shouldn't have said that, but you've got a flood of people, and it's come home, it's an unfunded mandate. There's a lot of issues here.
No, I understand. All I was doing,
People, you got a flood, you got a flood like you've never seen.
I understand. All I was trying to do
Labor
was,
markets with human capital depressing wages and screwing everything up, and nobody wants to, put their arms around the fact that these guys are
I understand. We're introducing,
studying degrees,
I understand.
going on various.
Well, I understand, John.
Okay,
I understand.
Yeah, her message is a little harsh, and also you're kind of picking, when you start picking on children, you always have a problem.
Yes,
You know?
that's what I was talking about, was the message as an introduction to our,
the message.
as a message to our, and as an introduction to our immigration rant, where we did actually come up with a couple of potential solutions, if they can be done. So I would hope everybody would check out that particular thing, and that particular rant. It's in two parts again, with a little cutoff piece in the middle. Ustream just don't quite know how to use the technology yet. But I want to thank our sponsors, all of which disagree with one or more of my stands and rants, but all of the sponsors want this type of frank discussion to continue. PianoByAngelo.com, that's Angelo Lambesis, who teaches and plays keyboards and appears Friday and Saturday nights at Russell's on Kirby Lane. ZitaDesign.com, that's Z-I-T-A, design.com, for all of your decorative painting needs. Faux, she can make anything look like anything, to be honest with you. AustinAreaPlumbing.com for all of your plumbing needs. Tico, T-I-C-O, AdventureLodge.com. It's a small hotel in Samra, Costa Rica, near an excellent learn-to-surf beach. And our newest sponsor, Amhar Tequila, which is at SantosSpirits.com. S-A-N-T-O-S, spirits.com. It's an extremely smooth tequila. I went to one of their openings last week, and I don't normally like tequila, but it was really, really smooth. And Wilcox, I appreciate your input on this stuff,
Yeah.
and I hope that everybody will pull up that immigration rant. Please keep sending the emails and the messages, and calling me and talking to me directly, those of you that know my number. And hopefully we'll be able to work some of these through some of these things and come up with some solutions, and kick through those messaging media outlets. Thank you very much.